Tax in historic houses. I'm Clarissa Levi, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And I'm Richard Harwood. I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
So we all love visiting a historic house in this country, and I'm delighted to say that we're joined this morning by Sarah Roller, Director of Policy and Public Affairs at Historic Houses. Good morning, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me.
So would you like to start by introducing historic houses for anyone who's not familiar with HH, and just explain what your role is?
Of course. So Historic Houses is a not-for-profit membership association representing around 1,450 independent historic houses across the UK. We exist to represent, advise, advocate for and support our member places to ensure that they stay alive for centuries to come. And we also do everything we can to champion what they do because we really think it's fantastic. As Director of Policy, I lead our advocacy work, which is partly within our own sector, so championing independently owned heritage to other heritage sector stakeholders, but also to government, to politicians, and to the general sort of outside world. I spend a lot of time in the detail of fiscal and legal framework that shapes how heritage operates today.
So we're going to sort of mainly look about sort of tax, but the starting point of historic houses is how do they function, and so how then does the tax system relate? So how's running a historic house different from running another business?
So stately homes and historic houses of all sizes actually have increasingly become run as businesses over the last sort of 50 years. One of the unique points about them compared to any other business, though, is that they have this incredibly highly listed historic building at their heart, which absolutely swallows money. So lots of the revenue, lots of the profit that any of these businesses make as visitor attractions, as event venues, anything like that, the profit goes right back into the repair and maintenance of that historic building. To give you an idea of the kind of sums we're talking about, our members report an annual average spend between them of £150 million on repairs and maintenance, which averages out at around £100,000 each every year. So you can get the kind of scale of what we're talking about here. And it also, I think, plays into the idea that heritage isn't particularly rational as a business decision. Running a business from a heritage asset is not what you do if you were really after making money. You do it because you love it. And that's very much the case for most of our members.
And in terms of the properties historic houses are interested, what extent are those privately owned in the sense of family owned, or to what extent are they from a more sort of business or sort of trust charity type relationship?
A real mixture. So our members, some of them are in genuine just private individuals, homeowners. Some are unincorporated. Some are very much limited companies and sort of trading as real businesses. Some are owned by charities. Some are owned by family trusts. Some are owned by charitable trusts as well. So there's a huge number of structures within that. And one of the things we often struggle with when, for example, DCMS is calculating the economic impact of heritage is they use methodologies which don't capture the breadth of that ownership style. So it really does come across everything. So ones that are charities obviously have slightly different financial considerations than ones which are private owners or businesses.
And when a lot of these houses were constructed, they would have been castles by medieval knights or by industrialists or by the owners of great estates. And a lot of the sources of the wealth which enable those houses to be built are perhaps no longer there, and the land is reduced, or there may not be a great deal of income from that. So how is it possible then to keep those houses running?
Diversification is the watchword, I'm afraid. It's a bit of a buzzword, but most of the houses, as you say, most of the people we represent are in rural areas. There are a few in cities, but most of them are rural. And historically, they probably did have a wider community and that kind of agricultural assets to support the house. Many of them still have some agricultural assets, and it's a diversified rural business, so all sorts of things kind of generate income. Some of my favorite things, so we've got everything from safari parks and like storage containers on your land. Someone has a doggy daycare, like fenced in thing that generates them loads of money and a couple of spare fields. But then loads of people make use of the historic house at the heart. So wedding venues, really popular to get married in a beautiful setting like that. Filming locations, big streaming giants like Netflix and Amazon will pay a large amount of money to take over your house. Some operate as visitor attractions. One of our member houses has a rare birds sanctuary, which is attached in their kind of what was their stables. So I'm always impressed by the resourcefulness and creativity of historic house owners in what they kind of do with the beautiful buildings that they have and how creatively they engage with them.
In terms of keeping the show on the road with a grand old stately home, I think we all can agree that tax is really important. And I'm always singing the song of tax policy and how it guides so much of our heritage. But the fate of our historic houses seem to be particularly closely tied with tax policies. So, Sarah, what are the taxes?
A range. So places that operate as businesses will pay normal business taxes like any other sort of SME or bigger organisation. So that might be national insurance contributions for the staff you employ, VAT, corporation tax, all of those kind of things. But if you're a family-owned historic house business, you're also going to face massive capital taxes. In particular, inheritance tax is a really big one. Every time someone dies, you're going to potentially have a really large bill on your plate as that passes down to the next generation. So they're probably the cool ones. Capital gains tax obviously also comes into play, and general other taxes. But I would say capital taxes are probably the biggest problem.
And the big headline one is, of course, as you say, inheritance tax. And I think we'll come back to this, but there are some changes on the horizon with inheritance tax, which I think is causing a little bit of fresh thinking about the future of tax planning for these country houses.
Yeah, and in the context of country houses, which have been here for centuries, often in the same family, how's the government historically approached how those houses should be retained?
It's a really good question. And as you say, I think there was this moment around the Second World War, just after the Second World War, where there was a crystallization in society more broadly that our historic buildings and our heritage was worth protecting. So that's when you get the advent of listing, 1944 and then 1947, Town and Country Planning Act. And in 1948, Clement Attlee's Labour government commissions this report called the Gowers Report, which recognises in its terms of reference that heritage is worth preserving, but how should we do this as a nation? Lots of buildings had really destructive things happen to them in the Second World War, amongst other sort of chaos. So what do we do next? And Gowers' report is published in June 1950. And he says, and I'm just going to quote from this because I think it's a really nice quote, he says, that it is in the public interest for houses of outstanding architectural or historic interest to be preserved is implicit in our terms of reference. That the owner of the house is almost always the best person to preserve it was the unanimous opinion of our witnesses and is our own firm conviction. That taxation is the chief cause of his being unable to do so is notorious.
Yeah, it's all about tax.
Yeah, encapsulates it. But it's that sense that heritage is worth preserving. And Gowers was an independently commissioned report. It was done by Labour. It was published just as things changed. But that has always been core to how we look at it. And I think now my job is really interesting. So I studied history. I love history. I came into this world because I really care about the kind of intangible assets of heritage. But increasingly, we have to justify heritage's existence through the economic arguments, because that's how government operates today. The economy is everything. It underpins so much of what we do in our very sort of late capitalist society. And so we spend a lot of our time quantifying heritage as a series of numbers. So I could say to you that in 2024, our members welcomed over 19 million visitors. They supported over 12,000 full-time equivalent jobs and generated £1 billion of expenditure for the UK economy. And that's what we spend a lot of time talking about too. And that's the argument government likes to hear at this point in time. They don't like the intangible stuff as much anymore.
Absolutely. So we're not going to save our country houses just because we love our heritage and just because it's important to us culturally. We're going to save them and implement tax policy accordingly because of money, because of, tourism take or whatever it is. And I have to say, HMRC agrees. HMRC in its policy document, in its guidance around some of the tax exemptions which apply here, actually says, I think this is so interesting, that successive governments have wanted to conserve and protect the national heritage. And they've taken the view that so far as possible, property of this kind, as in country houses, should remain in private hands, and that its owners should be encouraged to retain and care for it and display it to the public. And I think that is really fascinating. So what we're trying to do here with our tax policy is keep the national heritages in our stately homes in private ownership. Why do you think that is, Sarah?
On purely economic basis, it's incredibly cost effective. So it comes back to money, as always. I think part of that recognition in that statement you just read out from capital taxation and the national heritage, and part of what Gowers recognised too, is that the significance sometimes does stem from houses, families and collections have been together for, in some cases, 800, 900 years. And there is something special and intangible about having those things together. And if you sell or break up a collection, a family, a house, it loses something that we can't quite put our finger on. So I think it's a double-edged thing, right? It's cost effective for the government, but there's also a heritage argument in which these things all happen together. A house is just a building if it doesn't have a collection or a family, and sort of vice versa. So I think Those two arguments are really important.
The heritage ensemble of keeping it all together. I mean, to me, it comes out, if you want to be brutal about it, if we're going to preserve this part of our heritage, somebody's going to have to pay for it. Is it going to be the state or is it going to be the private owners? It's much, much cheaper for the state if it's the private owners. So that is why we're going to encourage them with tax incentives to keep these buildings in private hands. I mean, it's really that simple. So how is it done? What are the main tax benefits? Let's have a look. Shall we start with conditional exemption from tax?
Yeah, conditional exemption is one of the key tax mechanisms or tax reliefs which private owners can benefit from. And it's a really well-designed, clever, sort of perfectly balanced system. The more I think about it and the more I learn about it, the more it works. So just a bit of a précis on conditional exemption. It was introduced in 1975 by Dennis Healey as Chancellor, and it built on this pre-existing idea of exemptions. So 1896, late 19th century, you could exempt an artwork, which would remove death duties, and you could just hang it on your walls. Basically, it was there so that you didn't sell it probably to foreign collectors. That was a big problem at the time, according to the government. 1975, this changes. Conditional exemption is introduced. If you are a super highly listed house, if you have outstanding land or collections, you can apply to be conditionally exempt. So again, you're exempted from inheritance tax on those items, on that building, on that land, under certain conditions, and those are you commit to undertakings regarding repair and maintenance. So you work with relevant bodies, whether that be Natural England, Historic England, the Arts Council, to agree a repair and maintenance document, heritage management plan. And so you agree to spend money and time keeping the heritage in good condition. And the other side of it is that you agree to a certain amount of public access to that heritage. And again, you agree that in conjunction with arm's length bodies and with HMRC and the Capital Taxes Office. So it's a very sort of carefully maintained system. I think it works really well for two ways. One is that it fulfills that government aim of guaranteeing public access. It's a really good example of kind of public-private partnership in that way. And secondly, it's really cost effective. So often I like to think about it as you're asking the owners not to give a huge sum of money to HMRC or to the Treasury, but you're asking them to spend that money and sort of ring fence it for the repairs and maintenance that they've committed to. So it's a way of trying to sort of rechannel that money back into the care of heritage.
And I suppose it's reflecting some of the dangers long term to historic houses, one of which is the intergenerational change with inheritance tax, that otherwise either the estate gets diminished, either in terms of its collections or the size of it, because things have to be sold off to pay the inheritance tax bill, or the whole estate has to get sold and it may well go into a new owner's hands who's maybe actually incredibly wealthy, but one aspect of those incredibly wealthy owners buying historic properties and doing them up, which they often do very well, is that they're wealthy enough to want to sort of just keep them private.
Absolutely. And we always say about sales, right, is historic houses, sales happen all the time. I think Ripley Castle is still on the market. You can go and look at the sales particulars. It's a very entertaining read. What does a £12 million castle look like when you buy it? This brochure will tell you. It is really interesting because, as you say, the only people wealthy enough to be buying these amazing houses and to have the income to keep up with the repairs and maintenance, to employ the staff that you need to keep them looking good, they're probably people who are wealthy enough not to need to run them as a business or welcome visitors through their doors. And that's the trade-off. We have a system in which private property ownership is very much the norm, but with heritage, it comes with this sort of interesting sense of public interest in these historic buildings. And how do we make those two things work together, private ownership and public interest?
With conditional exemption, which I think about in a very simplistic way of just people who've got historic houses not having to pay the tax that the rest of us would have to pay because they are opening them to the public and they are looking after them in the way that they've promised. There's no guarantee, is there, that the tax that's foregone, there's no direct link with it being the exact same amount of money being spent on maintenance and repairs, is there?
No, there's not, other than committing to a repair and maintenance plan. But no, there's no obligation to channel that, whatever they calculate as your tax bill, back into it.
But in your experience, that's nonetheless what happens, as I understand it.
I would say so. I mean, the repair and maintenance obligations vary from place to place, but everyone we represent has huge repair and maintenance bills. And if they can spend that money on doing more work, making the roof watertight, sorting out all these sort of ongoing problems, that feels like a good use of that money. And clearly the government agrees.
Yeah, so no one, as you say, you said at the beginning, no one is making an enormous profit on owning a castle with a leaky roof. And so if, to the extent that they are sort of not being charged tax that otherwise would be chargeable, that money probably is going straight back into looking after the roof. And how would you say that conditional exemption actually changed the fate then of country houses? From your research, has there been a great big turnaround since conditional exemption existed?
There has, for lots of reasons. And I know you had Ben Cowell, our Director General, on talking about his book, this sort of British country house revival, which also charts this period of history. So conditional exemption was introduced in 1975. That was at the same time, roughly, as the V&A's destruction of the country house exhibition, which also had a massive impact on kind of public perception of country houses. So there's a lot of things going on there. Conditional exemption was incredibly helpful in driving public access to heritage. So I looked at the numbers. So for context, about 300 historic houses in the UK have conditional exemption arrangements. About 150 of them are members of historic houses. So I've got some nice sort of interesting bits of analytics from our own data. Of the 150 people we represent, I would suggest that probably 5 to 10, you could count them on two hands, of houses. The kind of commercial revenue driving the treasure houses are people who have amazing stately homes, and they're very professional in how they display them and open them to the public. And that's one category of historic house. But there are a lot of people who probably wouldn't have had the impetus to develop proper visitor attractions had they not had conditional exemption obligations in the first place. So lots of people will be told they have to open for 28, 30, 40 days a year. But looking at the numbers, 90% of our members who are conditionally exempt open for more than the days that they're stipulated, and probably 2/3 of that 90% are opening for considerably more than the days that are stipulated. So conditional exemption, I think, has driven this idea of heritage as a visitor attraction. And also it has ultimately kept houses, collections and land together and maintained that element of sort of intangible heritage significance through doing so.
Absolutely. So conditional exemption really is the reason why, as the public, we're allowed to go and see country houses. And it is such an enormous national pastime, isn't it? Going to see these, not just National Trust, but other country houses that wouldn't be available to us if it weren't for this particular tax benefit.
Yeah, I think so. And I think also one of the joys about going to historic houses places as opposed to a National Trust place, for example, is that lots of the places that we represent are still lived in. And when you go around, it can sometimes feel like snooping through someone's actual house. There's an intimacy to some of these houses, which Chatsworth does not feel like someone's house. I know that the Duke of Devonshire definitely does have a flat there, but it's not someone's house. And the same way the National Trust houses, in many cases, they're set dressed to look like a home, but they're not. But Robert Parker, who is our technical advisor at Historic Houses, lives in a place called Brusham Hall in Lancashire. And when you look around that, it's an amazing house. I think it's the oldest family house still in Lancashire, but it feels very intimate. It's family history. And Robert's house, actually, I think was the first house to get a conditional exemption arrangement back in 1975. And it's exactly the kind of house where they probably wouldn't have opened to the public had they not had that conditional exemption obligation. But actually, isn't Lancashire and the rest of us all richer for them doing so?
What's the scope of conditional exemption? So what buildings or land or objects can benefit from it?
So there's 5 different categories. One is outstanding land. One is essential amenity land. So things that are in the sort of immediate vicinity. You get outstanding buildings. So again, probably grade 1 or 2 star listed. You get really significant works of art. So you might have a Rubens or a Canaletto or that kind of thing. And you also get a category, which is my favourite, called historically associated objects, which recognises that in some cases it's about this wider collection of items, none of which are particularly high monetary value, but they have some intangible connection to the place. So I was doing a little whip round about some of the more interesting objects earlier this week. And 2 of the ones that stood out to me as kind of like really random things one was a dog collar that someone has a historically associated item for. And one was at Penshurst Place in Kent. It was a fragment of Sir Philip Sidney's shaving mirror from the 16th century, which on its own is a pretty niche piece of collector's memorabilia, but is part of the important story of Penshurst Place. And that's why it's included in that. So it's quite remarkable.
And those are also actually items which there's not otherwise really any control over moving them. So dog collars aren't subject to listed building consent. Removal, probably not going to get caught by the Waverley criteria on export. The Getty Museum wants to buy the dog collar. So a mechanism for encouraging them to stay as part of that family collection is conditional exemption.
Absolutely. And I would also say that I've given you some slightly wacky examples, and there are these 5 categories, but there is actually quite a high bar to conditional exemption too. So the criteria on government is outstanding to our national story and national significance, and they are pretty rigorously assessed. So you're not getting through with your average little sort of country house, you do have to have real historic or architectural significance. And the same with those objects, right? They may be part of a sort of slightly amusing story of a wider collection, but there's something there that's been independently assessed by an arm's length body, which has clarified that they do think that that is worth keeping and there is heritage significance to it.
But Grade 1 or Grade 2 star would catch quite a lot of houses. And some of those houses will be, particularly Grade 1s, are going to be pretty grand. Some of them, particularly quite a lot of Grade 2 star, will be relatively modest, but very good individual family homes. And there's quite a lot of the 20th century modern houses, Conrad Lucas and so on, are Grade 2 star. Awful lot of Letchens, Bailey Scott, and so on. So a lot of more modest properties would be capable of coming within that outstanding category.
Theoretically, yes. But Clarissa, you might have something to add about kind of the rigour of it.
I do think this is actually one of the things that's so brilliant about our policy generally, about our heritage, is that there's no snobbery about it. We're not just saying it's got to be a grand old stately home. No, it can completely be a modern house as long as it's kind of interesting, as long as we want to see it and we want to preserve it. It sort of doesn't matter on what basis. And I absolutely love that. I love that we're saying in this country that our national heritage is a living thing. It is a house that is lived in. It is an object which can be used, a dog collar that can be put around a dog's neck. I mean, I remember a claim that I helped with for conditional exemption included some musical instruments that continued to be played because they're sort of living objects. And that didn't mean that they couldn't be conditionally exempted. And the brilliance of that was that it meant they wouldn't have to be sold. But they continue to be used. And as long as the owners are giving them the public access they've promised and looking after them in the way they've promised, then why not? I just think it's a particularly enlightened view of heritage to say, well, we're not going to judge in advance what the heritage is, but we'll judge everything on its merits and allow it to be used. I think the same goes for houses as well and land.
Yeah. So we've just been discussing conditional exemption. We picked up on agricultural and business nature of an awful lot of these country houses. How do the proposals from the government affect how the houses may thrive in the future?
I think they'll have a really big effect, and it's quite hard. And the OBR itself has said they don't really know how these changes will play out because behavioural change is such a big part of inheritance tax anyway. So the changes that were announced in the October budget, previously business property relief and agricultural property relief gave you 100% relief on inheritance tax for the qualifying assets. So you could basically pass your business down to the next generation inheritance tax free if you planned it properly. The same with farms. So it's been called the family farm tax. This changed because farmers were previously using agricultural property relief. The budget changed that. So it kind of both merged and capped the relief. So you get 100% relief on the first £1 million of qualifying assets between business property relief and agricultural property relief. And then after that, you get a 50% relief on everything above £1 million. So it might sound generous, and I'm sure to some people it is, but in real terms, it's going to be quite difficult for a lot of people. So it's not just the value of your sort of business assets, but the other thing which I find really interesting is the idea of what's the value of your brand, of your intellectual property. When you're valuing something like this, how do you do it? So my example, I don't know if this is real or not, by the way, I don't know what their situation is, but for example, Castle Howard, how do you value the brand of Castle Howard, which was where Brideshead Revisited was filmed and is an icon to millions of people? How does that work? I don't envy people from the Valuations Office Agency who are going to have to figure that one out for them.
It's a fascinating one and very relevant as well. So in my particular line of work, I've been thinking about artists' estates because quite often artists will run their studio as a business, obviously, and would have expected, in many cases, would have expected their business to be inherited by the next generation and carry on running as a business. But now there's going to be inheritance tax payable when previously it wouldn't have been expected that it would be subject to inheritance tax. So now the whole game has changed. And even more so for things, I mean, in the art world, even more so for dealers, art dealers. So in other words, just businesses which would have expected to pass down to the next generation free of inheritance tax will now, to a certain extent, be subject to inheritance tax. And so they're going to have to think of some way to pay that so that the businesses can keep running. That's what we're really talking about.
Yeah, it is. And I think looking at our membership, lots of people make use of business property relief because it makes sense for them. It's 100% relief if you run your historic house as a business. And obviously HMRC has stringent sort of capacity about what that means, but it does exist. And so people have planned, people who might be in their 60s or 70s now have planned to use business property relief or planned for their heirs to use that. And in the UK, we have a lifetime giving rule. So if you give things away 7 years before you die, then that is inheritance tax free. But lots of these people are getting to a point where 7 years, they might not cut it. It's a conversation. We culturally hate talking about death, right?
When are you going to die?
Exactly. And lots of people are suddenly thinking, oh my gosh, I'm a bit screwed here because my parents are in their 80s and we are going to have this new bill. But even people who aren't, people who are in their 50s, you might have teenage children are suddenly thinking, oh gosh, should I sign over my historic house and my business now, or any business? Should I do it now because I've got a pretty good chance of living 7 years? So that's what I mean by about the behavioural change shift is hopefully, maybe I'm being optimistic in the light at the end of the tunnel, but if it encourages conversations about succession planning, that's probably a good thing for lots of businesses. But government won't say that that's what they wanted to do by this tax change, which makes it difficult. And there's a generation of people who really don't like talking about death, and it's a very individual thing. And it is obviously sometimes a difficult conversation.
I'm always encouraging people to talk about death. I mean, it's literally my favourite thing with families. You've got to talk about the difficult things. But it is a very interesting question. When am I going to hand over the keys to my children? Because it's just not always a possible thing to do. And I see what you mean about lifetime gifts as behavioural change. But there's another big change which sort of suggests itself, which is that if I have got a family business and I want it to go to the next generation, and I know now that it's not going to do that free of tax because of the new budget changes. Do you think, Sarah, there's going to be a big uptake in interest for the conditional exemption that we've just been looking at from inheritance tax as an alternative to business property relief?
I certainly think people are rethinking about it. I would say from the off that conditional exemption is a regime which is quite hard to exit. It's not impossible. There are lots of ways you can do it, but leaving is expensive and difficult. Tax accrues, it's not ideal. So when people enter conditional exemption, they are effectively signing up future generations to continue that.
To recap, so basically your dad dies, your parents die, and you get let off the tax that you would normally have had to pay on it because you've promised to show the house to the public and show the contents of the house to the public and keep them in good repair. If you want to exit that regime, which means, in other words, if you want to sell the house anyway in 10 years' time, you have to pay the inheritance tax that you didn't pay when it should have been paid. But now, instead of paying the bill that would have existed 10 years ago, you're going to be paying the same rate of tax, but on the current value of the house. So that's what we're talking about. That's why it's expensive to exit the regime.
Yeah. And people do. We regularly hear of people paying off, if they have a work of art, for example, which might be more manageable, to pay that charge. Some people decide that it's not for them, and if they can make it work, they will pay to exit the regime. But others, that's never going to be the case. They're just never going to, if your whole building and collection is exempt, that's a huge bill that you just are unlikely to be able to afford.
But you might do that because, for example, you've got one desk or one painting that is conditionally exempt, and that's meaning that you're having to rejig your whole life around opening your house to the public for a month a year. And so if you can afford to actually just pay the inheritance tax on that desk or that one painting, then you might choose to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly why I think that whilst there's new interest in conditional exemption, and I'm sure some people will choose to opt into the regime following these changes, but people choose to opt into the regime year on year, every year anyway. So I don't know whether there will be a marked uplift. But it's been around for 50 years as a relief, and people have chosen not to enter the scheme because it doesn't work for them, because they want to enjoy private property as private property and not have that arrangement of public-private partnership.
Well, it absolutely isn't appropriate for everyone. I literally was advising a family only recently who had small children and a baby on the way, and it just wasn't going to be appropriate for them to have strangers having free flow access to their house. I had to think, well, what about bath time? You've got a screaming toddler having a meltdown and you're trying to bathe the baby, and you can't have strangers wandering around your house. So absolutely, so it's not for everyone. And I actually think that is something I find enormously comforting about the whole regime. It's not dead easy. There is an actual quid pro quo to not paying the inheritance tax that the rest of us have to pay. It is a meaningful thing to actually open up your house to the public.
Yeah, it really is. And I think increasingly, I know that for the first sort of 25 years. There was a big scandal in the late 90s around it being abused effectively. Some people were abusing it as a scheme, but I think that really has changed. And I get to meet lots of really interesting people in my line of work, many of whom have conditional exemption arrangements, and they do take it really seriously. When they get a request, they respond and they say, this is part of the deal. And actually, often it will be researchers who want to come around and look at something. And how lucky for them. They get to have a couple of hours with this really smart, intelligent person who's researching some very niche item of their collection that they might not know very much about. So some of them are like, what an amazing deal. Not only is it a good deal for us and it works for us that way, but, what a privilege to be able to show these items to specialists, but also to the general public. So how lovely.
And of course, most people, at least who have bought historic houses, do it because they are historic or they're of interest, whether it's a very old one or a very recent one. But it passes down the generation. So to take the example I sort of floated of a Grade 2 star, sort of large but relatively modest house, say, nice bit of London. Yes, you could go for a conditional exemption, potentially. It does have the access restrictions, which are not so good when the next generation have got 3 young children in the house and so on. But if at some point they want to sell, rather than, as you normally do with your own house, you sell free of tax, the inheritance tax rate will catch up with them. So those sorts of properties, it's quite a family debate whether that is actually something to pursue if they want to keep the house within the family.
I have to say, my experience has been the same as yours, Sarah, that generally speaking, if people are looking at conditional exemption of their homes, they normally turn to it with enormous pride and are completely delighted when people want to show up. And they're desperate to show off their collection of teapots or whatever it is that's been conditionally exempted.
But one other aspect of conditional exemption is where it may become a greater use is the conditional exemption of land which is of great scenic value. So the HMRC will say, well, generally speaking, you're looking national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, which are now referred to as national landscapes. Okay, they're not totally good stuff in there. They won't accept. But if you have a house and something in the estate that's farmed and have been relying on the business and agricultural exemptions, and you happen to be within a national park or a national landscape, conditional exemption may well be an attractive route through.
It can be. I mean, Natural England are the sort of arbiters of the land side of conditional exemption. And again, not everything that falls into those areas will meet the criteria for conditional exemption. And again, you as an owner do have to make serious obligations about how you will look after that landscape and the kind of public access you'll grant. So some people might explore it. I don't think it will be huge swathes of AONBs in national parks and national protected landscapes who suddenly are conditionally exempt at all. I just don't think that's going to be likely. But Natural England, arm's length body, are the arbiters of those decisions to some extent.
I love the way if there's like an ugly plastic pig shed or something on an otherwise really beautiful bit of land, you can just sort of exempt everything around it. And so like the guidance does actually envisage all this kind of thing. I mean, it envisages incredible things that you can do in terms of conditional exemption, because I think what's so beautiful about all of this is that there is a real willingness on the part of HMRC and the government to actually make this work. Nobody's trying to make it difficult. It is something that is so in everybody's interest. It's such a kind of win for absolutely everyone, because we all get to see areas of land and houses and collections which we otherwise wouldn't see, but as a result of conditional exemption. And then it gets looked after in private hands. And it's just such a kind of virtuous circle that what I've noticed from dealing with claims for conditional exemption is that everyone gets involved from all sides, from the authorities down to the landowners, to try and make it work. And if there is a difficulty, like an ugly plastic pig shed or whatever it is, then you kind of find a way to work around it. And I really love that about our heritage tax exemptions generally, that everyone is broadly speaking in favour and want to make it work.
Yeah, and I actually think it's also really lovely because it's one of the few taxation departments at HMRC, I guess, where it's really person to person. Because it's really niche, it is ultimately quite a niche department, but there's a little tiny department of the CTO who deal with conditional exemption. There are people in each organisation, whether that be the Arts Council, Historic England, Natural England, there are the owners, and it is a really human process. And that's so lovely because so making tax digital is making everything just forms and phone lines and horrible gov.uk web pages. And how nice that this happens. But yeah, as you say, Clarissa, everyone wins. And I think one of my pet hates is seeing people kind of write it off as this scheme for people to dodge tax. And it's like, actually, this is an incredibly carefully thought through, tightly constructed relief, which targets a very specific area of interest / problem for the government.
I absolutely couldn't agree more. I think that when you see people write it off, as you say, as sort of tax breaks for the rich, you can completely see how that is a sort of conclusion that you lazily could draw if you weren't thinking about it too hard. But actually, I think it is a really beautiful tax exemption. I think we're extremely lucky in this country to have it. And there is that very famous example of what happens when you don't have a tax regime like this to look after your national heritage. And that is, I mean, I can't remember exactly who it was that first came up with this example, but I remember going round the Loire Chateau in France with my dad when I was quite young and thinking, wow, these are amazing. I mean, absolutely extraordinary buildings. They are so impressive. But you go inside and there's not a lot of human interest there. Though they are extraordinary buildings, they don't have that collection necessarily. They don't have the furniture. You can't really see how they were lived in because there's no contents anymore. And the reason for that is because they don't have conditional exemption. And so the reason why you go around houses in this country houses will have absolutely all the stuff. You can see how the house was lived in. You can see how the kitchens were used. You can see what the downstairs rooms were. You know, there's a flower arranging room in the basement. There's a series of bells to call the servants. And there's a tatty old rug. And there's all of that stuff really goes to an understanding of how our history has evolved and how the house was lived in. And that is what I think, by just dismissing these tax incentives as why should the rich house owners not have to pay the inheritance tax the rest of us do, I think it really is missing a very important, a thoughtful approach is to say, well, that's why we get to enjoy the heritage that we can.
And that's why we have whole cultural giving schemes in more broadly, right, is government does recognise the value of art and heritage and culture in a myriad of different ways through tax policy and otherwise.
Absolutely. So conditional exemption, I think we can definitely credit it with a great deal of heritage that we're all able to access that we otherwise wouldn't be. And so, Sarah, how optimistic are you then for the outlook of our historic houses? Because you've explained that obviously they're incredibly expensive to run. Nobody does it for the money. How are you feeling now at historic houses about the future?
I think the future is always an unknown. I would say we're pretty optimistic, cautiously optimistic sometimes, but generally optimistic. And one of the privileges of my job, I always say, is the people you get to meet. And I'm never not impressed by how resourceful and entrepreneurial and creative historic house owners are. They make things work that you really would never expect or never even imagine. So I think as long as you continue to have this sort of group of people who are really passionate and care and will do pretty much anything to make it work, then there's hope. There's hope for our historic houses yet. But like any business, they're operating in a difficult business environment. Post-COVID, with a cost of living crisis, with stagnant economic growth, with a bit of uncertainty in terms of political and economic direction, it's not super easy for any business at the moment, I don't think. And even worse for a historic house business where the roof is going to fall in with climate change happening or more extreme weather, more wear and tear on a building. And you've got to find that £500,000 for your new roof somewhere. So optimistic, but aware that might not be a sort of smooth road. There might be some bumps along the way.
Well, it's my two special interests in life, rock concerts and tax. I find this all an enormously encouraging environment for both of those things. So Sarah, thank you so much for that brief introduction, really, to conditional exemption and historic houses. Fascinating to hear about how it's all evolved. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.